Until next time.
Even in these crazy times we live in the middle of 2024, in which we've been through so many changes, in which we don't know what the next days hold, we, those who are always aware of the medium of video games and who are a part of it, can ask a person of our age, someone from a past time, or if you want, any child who must have been born in a year not that far away from 2014 or 2015, what is Street Fighter? And he will answer you exactly what it is: a fighting game. It's curious, you know, it has always generated me intrigue how fighting games got to the point in which they are today, and when I end up investigating into the topic for mere curiosity and see how Street Fighter contributed hugely to this to happen, I wonder why they're not talked about enough of this topic. Personally, I'm always surrounded by tons of online information related to video games, entertainment, gameplays, reviews, news, but I have never directly reached a background related to the history of fighting games in the medium, especially related to Street Fighter, so let's do it ourselves. For those who are interested in this in the future, join me on this journey. I'm Isma, and this it's a new retrospective: Street Fighter, the saga that changed video games forever. What many are probably wondering when watching this video is, was Street Fighter the first fighting game in history? No, it was not. That title is attributed to heavyweight champ in the year 1976 by Sega. It is the most referenced exponent when talking about this recognition. So what about Street Fighter? Why it became one of the most famous in the history of gaming, and why it succeeded? And the answer is fascinating. Street Fighter didn't create fighting games, but it did create the combos for the first time. Let's see, the first Street Fighter was not even the one who achieved this feat. The first game was an attempt by Capcom to get into the dense Cars genre of fighting games with the intention of mastering it. But in that first attempt, even though the characters had interesting designs and were very recognizable, they didn't achieve the expected success. For this, the formula had to be reinvented. What do I mean? It turns out that in Heavyweight Champ, for example, the fun was to see which of the two players chose the most effective and fastest move to knock down the rival first. Something very direct and with little depth that affected the reception of the title. Then Street Fighter, not only having a health bar so that the fights were longer and exciting, it also had a peculiarity in the hit animation of the characters. The combos had been born. Officially, combos were born for the first time in fighting games with Street Fighter 2 when the developers, without realizing it, saw that the opponent was unable to react due to the speed of linking between some attacks. And so, with how good the gamer community is at investigation into gameplay systems of titles they like, they found more and more combos that provided unique satisfaction, something that they've never felt before. When seeing this reaction, both Capcom and all the development houses of titles related to fighting games started to repeating the formula. They knew that the players loved combos, and not only on an entertainment level but on a technical level, because without realizing it they were structuring a new regimen of skill above luck, a regimen in which the fighting game would reward the good execution of commands to reach victory. The combos were not only stylish, they were necessary for the genre to consolidate as the giant it is right now. From them, so many things can be different, such as the range of a character's attacks, the total damage, and how this is escalating as more hits are connected. Frame data started to become a reality, and fighting games in its most competitive section became a debate of strategies and numbers which you had to understand through practice and experimentation to get the most out of these games. Goodbye to mashing random buttons, goodbye to duels won based on luck. Meritocracy was born. Now, what is meritocracy? This defines a system governed by talent, where your own merits take you far, without taking into account any external factors, just skill. And this is a term that reigns over many of today's competitive games, without discrimination of any type of genre. Without even wanting to try, Street Fighter had created one of the biggest and successful phenomena in the video game industry. From this moment on, Street Fighter gave a lot to talk about in the ever-growing fighting game community, being one of the games that have almost never been omitted in an EVO celebration, the most important event and tournament in this field of gaming. In fact, Street Fighter is one of the main promoters of these tournaments, since its merit and contribution to fighting mechanics through the years is undeniable. But after Street Fighter 2, what was next for the series? 2 years later, a different edition would arrive, Super Street Fighter 2. Before, we had already had 2 more versions, such as the Champion Edition or Street Fighter 2 Turbo Hyper Fighting. However, Super Street Fighter 2 was the one that laid the foundations for a different game system, modifying the frame data of some very specific movements in very specific fighters. The perspective was a little different and included 4 new characters, in addition to alternative game modes that started to become a trend in other franchises little by little. It should be noted that at its time, this was the heaviest game that had ever been released for the Sega Mega Drive, with 40 megabytes in total. If they knew that we now were using more than 100 gigabytes just by playing Warzone, they would blow their minds. A couple of years later, the saga returned with Street Fighter's Alpha Warrior's Dream, one of the first who, in my opinion, applied one of the rhythm changes that most favored the series on its gameplay. Is here when, for the first time, at least in my case, I identified a more accelerated kinesthetic, but without getting off the rails in a more button mashing style. It was the ideal speed. This is a colorful game that expresses its virtues every time it has a chance, one of the first examples of Capcom's pride in its then biggest IP. I would like to make a parenthesis to highlight one of the greatest virtues that this legendary saga has: its characters. And I'm not exactly talking about what makes a character interesting in general in a cultural medium, like the way in which he is written or how he has a notable development in a plot, because at the end, a character like Ryu, for example, you cannot deny his origins, the true reasons why he was created. A simple martial artist from Japan who is looking to become the best fighter in the world, facing dozens of fighters from different countries. With that premise in mind, and seeing the success of Street Fighter in the future, Capcom obviously started to deeper into the character's story, giving it a little more complex background. However, that is not what made Ryu or any other Street Fighter character interesting, but how they are designed. Yes, their costumes, corporality, and how it's presented in the gameplay. Most players are able to recognize a Street Fighter character just by his design, and based on it, try to guess what his fighting style will be. Taking Zangief, for example, a big fighter, tall, and has a very open guard, open hands, and confident. He is confident in his strength. This way, we can sense that he is a character who plays with grabs, traps his opponents by taking advantage of their physical strength and doing a large amount of damage. The same can happen with Blanka, who demonstrates a wild and impulsive fighting style, Chun-Li, a martial artist who has great strength in her legs, and so on with almost all the characters on the roster, thus creating variants of fighters like the Zoners, for example Guile, who uses projectiles to keep pressure on the rival. You can call this a kind of archetype for the structuring of a fighter in a fighting game, but Street Fighter was one of the first to understand this concept. Not only the movements and attacks matters, also the body language and how they are designed help a franchise begin to become recognizable, to generate a brand in people. But since we are at that, let's talk a little about how Street Fighter works as a video game. The scheme proposed by this game was pioneer in many of the mechanics that would be universally used in the genre in years to come. Obviously, these are one-on-one combats in which the goal is to reduce the opponent's health to zero. However, beyond just having the option to command fists, kicks, and special attacks to opponents, they let you go further without limiting your imagination. So you could press two buttons at the same time to execute different actions, command grabs, parries, and others, or the fact of executing diagonal movements with the control to make more combinations, which I will not deny, even today it costs me a lot when I'm learning to play a new fighting title. Consecutively, Capcom was releasing more and more titles: Street Fighter Alpha 2, X-Men vs Street Fighter Alpha 3, Street Fighter 3 Third Strike, Street Fighter X2, X3, and at the same time the industry was changing and evolving along with the players and what the modern fighting scene was looking for. In these times, thanks to Street Fighter, we had epic moments in our medium like the Daigo parry, the mythical Street Fighter Third Strike battle between Daigo Umehara and Justin Wong in August 2004, in which Daigo deployed a series of perfect parries to an ultimate from Justin in order to counterattack in the least expected way possible and win the fight. From moments like this, legends have been born that over the years have created their alter ego. Daigo himself wrote his own book titled The Will to Keep Winning, in which he relates several of his anecdotes as one of the longest fighting game participants in history. Street Fighter became a means for many people to find their purpose as gamers, and this is just one of many examples. From the third until the fifth entry of the saga, Street Fighter became a worldwide phenomenon in which it not only released more and more games, but it had comics, animated television series, merchandise of all kinds, and even live-action movies. Its participation in other titles accompanied by other IP also gave a lot to talk about, appearing next to the X-Men or with the characters of Tekken itself. Also, we can't forget its interaction with the Marvel characters in general, in the legendary saga of Marvel vs. Capcom, another of the great exponents of fighting games. What Capcom had created was nothing more and nothing less than the most representative monster of fighting games in popular culture, more than even Tekken, King of Fighters, or Mortal Kombat. Every player is able to reference Street Fighter as basically the father of fighting games. This doesn't mean that these sagas were not good or that they have not generated as much impact as Street Fighter did, but each of them will have their turn in next videos. For example, talking about a specific case such as Virtua Fighter, one of the first really successful 3D fighting games, is considered one of the niche classics, but it offered a different approach than Street Fighter, in which constantly attacking was encouraged. Since combos were almost non-existent, you had very few routes that really let you see something new, and the controls only offered punch, kick, and cover. Everything was too direct and simplified. The idea was to punch with the rival until one of the two fell. On the other hand, Street Fighter, based on its combo system and its hunger to complement the concept of fighting with other factors that could make it more balanced and entertaining, pushed players to discover a more slower, more rhythmic playing style, which it matters much more to know when to attack than the number of times you attack. The competitive capabilities in these games showed incredible patience on the part of the competitors, in which more than a game of skill, it's a mental battle, in which nothing is given lost until the last second of the encounter, until the last held pixel. By implementing elements such as perfect parries, grabs, mix-up possibilities, among many other things, Street Fighter consolidated its own style, one of the most unique today. They are a delight to play and watch. And speaking of currently, with the release of the most representative titles of the saga in the 2000s, it's not rare to find incredible stories of competitive players like the 2010 EVO champion in Super Street Fighter 2 Turbo, the PS3 remaster, Snake Eyes, who is considered the best Zangief in the world. He managed to make one of the most absurd comebacks in the history of the Street Fighter 4 competitive scene, in which he alone beat 5 opponents consecutively after his team was eliminated.
Oh, nice. And now... Oh! Snake Eyes! He crosses the finish line! He beat the marathon!
Also, the exciting story of the Latin player Mono, who was crowned as a champion of the CEO tournament using the worst character from Street Fighter V.
No, he ran into it! This is what Game of Thrones is gonna do it! Mono is the champion!
Street Fighter V 2021 gets it done!
Or, of course, the more recent coronation of Mena RD as the absolute Street Fighter VI champion, doing a brutal speedrun to his rival in the grand finals.
Life support!
Wait, dude, this is insane.
And the amnesia finally comes out, gets baited! Mena RD, EVO Japan 2024 champ!
This guy...
Give him that!
That is yours, my boy!
Assassin-like!
Indisputably, Street Fighter is a saga of games that came to the industry without any precedent, simply with the ambition to become a legend in the fighting genre. It was able to create legendary characters who can never be deleted from the memory of anyone close to video games, clashes between individuals that take motor capabilities to another level, and a huge legacy. Without having forecasted, it became not only one of the most important fighting games of all time, but the footprint that could never be erased from the book of the history of video games, the one that would mark the before and after of this beautiful genre called fighting game.